representative from the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, Alexandra Chyczij, president of the Ukrainian Congress, appearing virtually. Ms. Chyczij, please proceed with your opening statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. I would like to thank you for the opportunity of addressing you on the 162nd day of the war in Ukraine. Every morning since February 24th, I have been checking my phone and giving silent thanks that none of my friends or family were killed overnight. And then after I check my phone, I ask myself, what am I going to do today to end Russia's war against Ukraine? So today, what I am doing is testifying before you. On July 28th, Russian social media channels posted a video of a Russian soldier castrating a Ukrainian POW. The next day, Russian occupation forces in Olenivka murdered over 50 Ukrainian POWs. A week before that, the Russians bombed the port of Odessa, from which grain was to be exported. And the week before that, the Russians bombed a shopping center in Vinnytsia. And before that, Kremenchuk, Kharkiv, Mariupol. Evidence of mass rape of civilians, women, girls, and boys has been collected and documented. In March, after the Russians retreated, mass graves of civilians were found in Bucha. I visited Bucha in June, and what I saw, I assure you, I will never forget. I could go on, but suffice to say that we've all had a front seat view in our living rooms where we witnessed the horror of what Russia is doing in Ukraine. And since February 24th, Russia has earned over 100 billion euros in revenue from fossil fuels. 60% of that came from the EU. This is untenable. This is the financing of genocide. So today I ask you, members of the committee, the same question that I ask myself. What will you do today to end Russia's war against Ukraine? The Ukrainian Canadian Congress asks that you do the following, that you call on the government of Canada to revoke the permit that allows the ongoing servicing of turbines that enable Russia's terrorist war machine to function, and to restore full sanctions against Gazprom. And why do we suggest that? Because it's absolutely clear that Russia contrived the Nord Stream 1 debacle to test the resolve of Germany, Canada, and our allies on sanctions. And we have failed that test. Germany and Canada did not understand what the test was. It's about sanctions, the unity on sanctions, not just on Nord Stream 1, but on the ultimate prize, Nord Stream 2. Putin has not given up on that. So when Chancellor Scholz says that he called a bluff, he called the wrong bluff. But nonetheless, he's received a response, and now the choice is clear. It's time to restore those sanctions. As you know, the UCC opposed and continues to oppose the waiver of sanctions on Gazprom, and indeed the waiver of any sanctions as they relate to Russia and its genocidal war in Ukraine. It's been the long-standing position of the UCC that seeking to accommodate or placate Russia only emboldens them. The Russian regime responds only to strength. We know this because of events in the past, by Russia's war against Ukraine in the present, and will be borne out in the future as well, unless we collectively put an end to this. And Mr. Sorbara, that journey can't be long because too many Ukrainians are dying every day. So I submit to you that there is no reasonable justification for the continuation of the waiver, and there was none when the decision was first taken. As you review the testimony before you today, I ask you to consider two things. Did the government of Canada do everything possible to avoid lifting those sanctions? Did they leave any stone unturned before capitulating to what everyone knows was blackmail? And secondly, is there an ongoing justification to continue with the waiver? I believe that there were other options that Canada and Germany could have pursued, but it appears that they chose not to pursue them. Firstly, we already heard mention of the alternative pipelines through Ukraine and Poland. Now that would have been a bluff worth calling to put that choice to Putin. But Minister Wilkinson has said that that was not a viable choice, but ironically, are they a better choice than the 20% that Gazprom has now reduced the flow to? And we should also note that those pipelines running through Ukraine are the only piece of infrastructure that Russia has not yet bombed. Ask yourselves, why not? So there are also alternative energy suppliers on the global market. We have not heard any evidence on that point. And it appears that Chancellor Scholz was interested in only one alternative, the continued supply of cheap Russian gas for 2 more years and through a Gazprom-owned pipeline and not any other pipeline. As for the continuation of the permit, in light of what has transpired since July 9th, we submit there is no justification. As was entirely predictable, Russia did not restore the gas flow and is now demanding further concessions. First, the papers weren't in order. Now the repairs are defective. This dance will continue forever. And frankly, I am very troubled by the ease with which the Government of Canada granted the turbine waiver. It does not instill confidence that further concessions won't be granted. And one of the most important lessons that history has taught us is that appeasement of aggressors and dictators does not work. It has the opposite effect. It emboldens them. Appeasement is what got us here in the first place after the West remained silent on Georgia, on Chechnya, Crimea and the Donbass, Syria, on Salisbury, and countless other blatant violations of international law by Russia. And as NATO Secretary Jens Stoltenberg recently stated, if Ukraine loses, it's a danger for us. It will make Europe even more vulnerable to Russian aggression. So even if you don't care about the moral aspect of this, you should care about your own security interest. He went on to say, and so we must pay. We must pay for the support, pay for the humanitarian aid, and pay for the consequences of economic sanctions, because the alternative is to pay a much higher price later on. Yes, we pay a price, but the price we pay as the EU and NATO is a price we measure in money. The price Ukrainians pay is measured in the lives lost every day. So it's time for Canada and our allies to finally take the upper hand in dealing with Russia and to say no to blackmail and stop responding to their demands. Thank you for the time.
Thank you very much, Ms. Chyczij. We'll go right to Mr. Bazan, who has a 6-minute round. Mr. Bazan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank UCC and Alexandra for appearing today. This is a very troubling time. It's embarrassing that the government of Canada capitulated. I appreciate your thoughts with everyone in Ukraine and for your strong advocacy on behalf of Ukraine here in Canada. So you talk about the sanctions regime. Do you believe that this is the thin edge of the wedge that could potentially topple the entire sanctions regime with the return of the turbines? And do you believe that every time Putin wants to call his bluff, as Minister Wilkinson said, that Canada is going to be suckered in?
I think this is the first waiver of sanctions that we have seen. I think it is the thin edge of the wedge, and the way to resolve it is to revoke that permit and show Putin that the West will not be toyed with.
Thank you. Now that more revenues are flowing back to Russia because, or potentially could flow back to Russia with the return of the turbines, do you believe Canada should be increasing its military assistance to Ukraine as well as humanitarian relief?
We have always advocated for more and continued assistance to Ukraine. We are, of course, grateful for the support that the Government of Canada has provided to date, but the war is not over. The economic situation in Ukraine is deteriorating. They need more help. And of course, on the military front, the Ukrainians must be allowed to win this war. They're prepared to fight our fight, the West's fight, and the least we can do is support them militarily.
So you would agree, or UCC would agree, that military equipment like sending the new sniper rifles that are sitting at PGW Defense in Winnipeg should be purchased by the government of Canada and supplied to Ukraine, or that the armored ambulances that we have on inventory that are about to be retired, there's 32 Bisons that are configured as armored ambulances that should be sent to Ukraine to help save lives, or that the soon to be retired vehicles, light armored vehicles that we have, the entire fleet, Coyotes and Bisons and M113s, track labs are all about to be retired. Are those the things that Canada should be supplying right now to Ukraine and that Canada has dragged its feet on?
Mr. Bazan, I never thought that I would have to learn the language of war or understand military procurement. And it pains me every day that I have to do that. I don't pretend to be a military expert. When we are asked these questions, we defer to our embassy in Ottawa to assist us in understanding what the needs of Ukraine are. All I can say is if Canada has it, we should send it. Thank you.
When we're looking at the atrocities as you laid out, and we talk about the capitulation by the government of Canada, what should we be doing? And aside from revoking the waiver and reversing this ill-advised decision, what should the government of Canada be doing to ensure that those that are responsible for the atrocities and war crimes that we're witnessing are brought to justice? Well, we of course have the International Criminal Court that has taken steps and opened investigations. There is ongoing work with the Office of the Prosecutor General. Personally, I would like to see Canada playing a greater role in the prosecution of war crimes. We are blessed to have amongst us a prominent jurist, the Honorable Louise Arbour, who has direct experience in that. She has prosecuted a genocide in her lifetime. And I would encourage the Government of Canada to assign Madame Arbour to that role to represent Canada in that effort. Mr. Chair, I think it's very unfortunate that we have only invited UCC to be here for half an hour when they are the leading voice of the Ukrainian diaspora and those of us of Ukrainian heritage that live in Canada. And they are so knowledgeable on the crimes against humanity that occur in Ukraine, on what Ukraine needs. They're in constant communication with the government of Ukraine. So I'd like to move the following, that the committee invite the Ukrainian Canadian Congress back to answer additional questions on the matter currently before the committee for an additional hour before August the 20th.
Thank you, Mr. Bazan. We have a motion on the floor. Does anyone wish to speak to the motion?
Mr. Chair, my hand is up in the room.
Ms. Ben-Dayan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I think that it's very important to hear from the UCC. I'm certainly glad that they're joining us here today. I think it's a bit unfortunate, actually, that a motion was moved by a Conservative during the UCC's testimony, because it does take away time from this important discussion. And I think we should maximize the amount of time that we have with the Ukrainian Congress while they are with us. And while I appreciate the suggestion, it could be something that we deal with when we don't have witnesses before us. So I would move to adjourn debate on this motion.
Sorry, Mr. Clerk, I'm going to need a little assistance from you on this. We have a motion on the floor.
So we have to vote.
We have to vote on that motion.
To adjourn debate, we have to vote on that motion first, since it's not debatable. So the motion from Mrs. Ben-Dayan to adjourn debate.
Okay, so I call the question. Is that on Ms.? Okay. All right. So I'm going to call the question on Ms. Ben-Dayan's motion to adjourn debate on Mr. Bazan's motion.
So Mrs. Madame Ben-Dayan?
Je vote en faveur.
Mr. Sobara?
Aussi, je vote en faveur.
Mr. Sidhu,
In favor?
Mr. Sarai,
In favor?
Mr. Zuberi,
En faveur.
Mr. Lippert,
Opposed?
Mr. Genius,
No.
No, excuse me.
Monsieur Bergeron,
Oui.
I vote yes.
Monsieur Bezan,
No.
No. Oh, sorry. I'm getting ahead of myself. Sorry, James.
I got left behind.
So just to be clear, Mr. Lippert voted no. Okay, just because there was
Yeah, I voted no.
no. Mr. Bezan,
No.
Mr. Genius, you vote.
I voted no.
Monsieur Bergeron,
Oui.
Mrs. McPherson,
No.
so we have 6 yeas, 4 nays.
So the motion has been approved, and debate is now adjourned on Mr. Bazan's motion. Mr. Bazan, I think roughly 2 minutes left in your round. Please, you have the floor. Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just want to go back with UCC to talk about, the situation on the ground. If they can describe in more detail, where Ukraine needs more assistance. And now that Russia is receiving more revenues, or potentially more revenues through Gazprom, how Canada can invest in Ukraine to help them win this war.
Again, hearkening back to my earlier response, I am not a military expert, but I do believe...
I'm talking not just about military, I'm talking about the entire, the economy, humanitarian assistance, infrastructure, having a Marshall Plan, things along that line.
Well, obviously, the avenues that have been pursued by the Allies so far, I think where we could see more is even greater sanctions. I don't believe that we have seen the sanctions from hell that President Biden forecast many months ago. They seem to be coming in spurts, and I think that they could be certainly more aggressive and more comprehensive. On the economic support, Ukraine has had to ask for a waiver of interest payments on the international debt that it owes. Inflation is forecast at the contraction of the economy is forecast at something like 40%. And Ukraine does need economic support to keep small businesses going. What I marvel at is the fact that there is any business or any economy functioning at all in these wartime conditions. So anything that we can do to assist on the humanitarian aid front, while Canada has welcomed, I believe, close to 50,000 Ukrainians in the last few months, there is ongoing support that can be provided to our allies in Europe, where the bulk of the displaced persons remain. They are reluctant to leave the continent.
Ms. Chyczij, I hate to interrupt, but there are other members who we have such a short time, so you know how fast a half an hour goes by. And so Mr. Sidhu is now up for 6 minutes. Mr. Sidhu, you have the floor.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll be splitting my time with my colleague Francesco Sorbrera. Ms. Chyczij, thank you for being here with us today and for taking the time to share some of your thoughts and your statement today in this very important meeting. Ms. Chyczij, as you may be aware, just this week, Canada imposed further additional sanctions as we continue to stand side by side with Ukraine. There is no doubt that Canada will continue working with our international partners and allies to explore additional measures. As stated by Minister Joly, studies show that Russia has lost companies worth nearly 40% of its GDP as a result of the many sanctions imposed by Canada and our allies. Given the significant volume of sanctions announced, it is sometimes difficult to compare When it comes to sanctions against industries such as oil and gas and luxury goods, are you aware of any other G7 countries that have implemented as expansive measures as Canada?
I do not have our comparison chart at hand. Our office does run that metric, and we can share it with the committee if you like. But one of the things that Canada certainly could do that would do more than actually sanctions is declare Russia a state sponsor of terrorism. That would take care of a lot of the issues that we are talking about. It would remove state immunity from Russia, and it would make them the pariah internationally that they deserve to be.
Mr. Chairman, okay to speak? Well, thank you, Ms. Chyczij. As you just mentioned, you've called for Russia to be declared a state sponsor of terrorism, terror, a designation Canada has only ever used against Iran. To your knowledge, have any other G7 governments implemented a similar designation against Russia?
That debate is ongoing. South of our border, our American friends, both houses are considering a motion to do just that. And as Nancy Pelosi, the speaker, said, if Russia isn't on the list of state terrorists, then tear up the list.
Thank you, Ms. Chyczij. Can you speak to the importance of Canada's continued support for Ukraine in terms of financial and military aid, and why it's important Canadians not become fatigued as this war drags on?
Because it's a war that Ukraine is fighting for all Western democracies. If Ukraine loses this war, as Jens Stoltenberg said, eventually that war will bleed out to Europe and beyond. And we know that from Putin's statements. You've all read his manifestos where he foresees a reconstitution, not just of the former Soviet Union, but of the Russian Empire. And we know that the support of Ukraine's neighbors is particularly strong because they know that all that stands between them and Putin are the Ukrainians.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll now turn the floor over to Francesco Sorbero, if you want to turn the floor over.
Thank you, Parliamentary Secretary Sadu. To the Ukrainian Congress, thank you for your testimony today. And obviously, we want the war to come to an end as soon as possible, and for Ukraine to have its territorial sovereignty and integrity protected and belonging to the Ukrainian people and no one else. Full stop. In terms of the view in the world, in terms of our allies and working together, wouldn't you agree that it's important for Canada to continue working with our allies? You know, you mentioned the United States. The United States did come out and say that they supported our decision on the turbines. The Europeans said the same thing. And in fact, moving the turbines back over to mainland Europe would not actually impact the amount of funds that Russia collects. Those are governed under a contract with Europe. I know MP Bazan alluded to this fact, but I'm going to have to disagree with that. That is my understanding of how that works, that it would not actually allow Russia to gain any additional funds. And I want to make that point, but don't you agree that Canada has been working with its allies, with Ukraine, even today, the announcement of the Canadian Armed Forces going over to the UK to again and continue to assist the training of Ukrainian soldiers in defending their territorial integrity of Ukraine?
The Ukrainian Canadian Congress certainly appreciates all of the assistance that Canada and allies have been providing. But on this point, we respectfully disagree. We believe that this was a test of unity on sanctions. And we believe that this has created a chink in the armor. And it's not too late to reverse that decision. It is a revocable permit. And we call upon this committee to ask the Government of Canada to revoke that permit. We have not heard what the Americans or any other allies have said since July 9th, when we've seen the result of the return of that turbine.
Chair, I'm finished in my line of questioning. Thank you. And thank you for your attendance today, Alexandra. And
obviously, God's blessings and Godspeeds to the people of Ukraine.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sorbera. Mr. Bergeron, you have the floor for 6 minutes.
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, first of all, I would like to assure UCC that they have our fullest support. The vote that took place a couple minutes ago does not in any way mean that we don't want to hear you for longer. It's quite the contrary. I made it clear to the clerk and to the chair that half an hour was not sufficient to have the opportunity of talking to you. Having said that, I don't think that it is the appropriate means of doing this is a last-minute motion to impose witnesses to members of this committee. But with that, I am completely open to having, of course, asking you to join us again as to appear as a witness again. In the meantime, maybe some progress will have happened as well. Now, you know that all the sanctions imposed by the European Union, was careful to target the energy supply coming from Russia. It's a precaution. Let's call this a precaution. That Canada did not resort to when it decided to introduce its sanctions regime, which led us to the situation in which Canada found itself. But considering the fact that the European Union was careful to avoid including in its sanctions all aspects that could touch energy supply coming from Russia, do you believe that this precaution would have nullified all the criticism, if you will, that the government of Canada's decision could have allowed the supply of oil and gas to Europe coming from Russia, and at the same time, of course, supplying the Russian war machine?
Thank you, Mr. Bergeron, for the clarification with respect to the motion. I am always ready to testify before this committee and any other. With regard to the EU sanctions, I believe that the EU will reconsider its position, given that we have now seen Russia cut off Poland and Bulgaria and Finland because they did stick to the sanctions when they were called upon to pay for Russian gas in rubles. They took a principled position, refused to do so, and Russia cut them off. I understand that Russia is now cutting off other countries and strategically cutting off other businesses and industries. And it is clear that Russia is engaging now in the continuation of the gas wars that they have played for the last 30 years. Every time there was a political problem with Ukraine, they would cut the gas off to Europe so that the Europeans would pressure the Ukrainians. But I think, when speaking of unity of the allies, one of the principles of that is that nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. And the point was made earlier with Madame Joly that Ukrainians are allies as well. And there is no unity on that question with the Ukrainians. They object to the waiver of those sanctions.
If we admit Canada's pretension that this authorization would have served to show Moscow's real motivation. And you heard Minister Wilkinson talking about having gas go through a Ukrainian pipeline and you underlined that this was the only infrastructure in Ukraine which is yet to be bombarded. Why do you believe that this infrastructure is an alternative, an interesting alternative, plausible and a valid alternative?
For the simple fact that it exists. There are pipelines through Ukraine and through Poland that are alternatives to Nord Stream 1. If this was about the turbine, you avoid the question of the turbine by using one of the other pipelines. If the question is about sanctions, though, then you don't avoid the question. And I think it has always been about sanctions, not about the pipeline or the turbine. And we have allowed ourselves, Canada has allowed itself to be party to blackmail that resulted in a waiver of those sanctions.
Thank you, Mr. Bergeron. Now we have Ms. McPherson for 6 minutes, and that will bring us to the end of our meeting with the UCC. Ms.
Thank
McPherson?
you very much. Thanks, Mr. Chair. And I would like to thank our guest from the UCC and just give my heartfelt thanks for the work that you and the entire organization has been doing over the last terrible months as we see what's happened in Ukraine. I know that not only are you expected to be the voice of Ukrainian Canadians, but you are also dealing with the horrific burden of what we are watching happening in Ukraine, and your bravery is admirable. So thank you for being here. Thank you for your voice. Thank you for the work that you've done to this point. Also very, very keen on having you come back and speak to the committee. So I look forward to that opportunity. I think what I'd like to ask is some questions just about the sanctions regime itself. So yes, I mean, I think we can look at what happened with regards to the waiver, and say that basically we've now set up a system where Germans aren't any better off for the weakening of our sanctions. That Putin has very clearly used this as a tool to blackmail our allies and blackmail us, and now it is proven to have worked. So why would he not use this same system with regards to food, with regards to energy in other countries? He has, as we know, weaponized food to the point where millions of people's lives are at risk. Will he use this to chip away at our sanctions? So it's a big worry that I have. And I just wonder from your perspective, if that's something that you see, if you do have some worry about setting a precedent where we allow a man like Vladimir Putin to blackmail Canada and to undermine our sanction regime.
Well, absolutely. And that has been the position of the UCC since before the war began. We warned in the months leading up to the full-scale invasion that strong deterrence was the only way to stop an invasion. We called for arming Ukraine, for sanctions before, and unfortunately, that only started to happen in the days and leading up to the war. Canada only made the decision to send lethal weapons some 10 days prior to the actual invasion. And so I urge you all to become historians, students of history, and understand who we are dealing with. Ukrainians, unfortunately, have lived with various versions of Vladimir Putin for over 300 years, and we know exactly how the psyche works. And appeasement does not work with him. Only a strong hand will show Putin that the West means what it says. And by caving on sanctions, we are showing him our weakness.
Absolutely. And I'm sure you were watching while the ministers were here providing testimony for us. And I did flag with Minister Joly that I'm very concerned about how our sanctions are being enforced, the lack of transparency so that parliamentarians can see, that Canadians can see what is being seized, what those assets are. I've brought it up in the House a number of times. I've asked it in order paper questions. A perfect example is that we learned yesterday that the CBSA was able to stop a shipment of dual-use weapons to Russia. But that's the only one that they can tell us any information about. They can't release details about any other shipments. And we also know from John Iveson's story on July 21st that Italian officials had seized Russian-bound drones sent via Canada and that the CBSA missed that shipment. So I'm wondering if you feel that, you know, when we hear the government talk about the 1,600 sanctions that they have in place, do you worry that it is performative, that this sanction regime is in fact a performative thing where they are saying the right things, they are telling us that the sanctions are in place, but there is no way for us to check, no way for Canadians to know if they're working, no way for us to measure the efficacy of that sanction regime?
The UCC would certainly welcome greater transparency on sanctions regimes. Since 2014, UCC called for the imposition of strong sanctions following the invasion of Crimea and the Donbass, and we did not see anything particularly muscular coming from Canada. We urged at a minimum a mirroring of what the Americans were doing, what the EU was doing. So we certainly would welcome greater transparency. And also we would like to see a beneficial ownership registry of in Canada, so that we could see who owns what. I mean, the purpose of sanctions is to freeze those assets, but I think the next step, and we've got the legislation in place now, is to seize them and sell them, and that can only happen if we know what we're looking for. And I think $120 million of seized assets is probably just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what is being controlled in Canada by Russians and their proxies.
Absolutely. And I have heard from people who have said that it is very difficult for us to even understand the shipping between Russia and Canada. And, you know, in fact, the transparency of the Russian Federation is higher than the transparency of the Canadian government in terms of that. So certainly I think there's a lot of work that the Canadian government could do to make sure that that's in place. And I agree with you that we 100% need to understand who is benefiting from these. I know these corporate relationships are very, very complex, and it will take some specialists to do that. So I look forward to working with the minister and working with all my colleagues to make sure that happens.
Thank you, Ms. McPherson, and that brings us to the end of our meeting with the
point
UCC.
of order.
Mr. Genis, you have the floor on a point of order.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wonder if you can clarify, the committee passed a motion specifically wanting to hear from the UCC, and we are hearing from them, but for an unprecedentedly short period of time. And you've heard from Conservatives, NDP, and Bloc that we think the time is too short. UCC is an extremely important organization representing Ukrainians across the country in of course, a very, very challenging context with the war going on. Could you clarify for the committee, given the motion that was passed, who made the decision that we should only hear from them for half an hour today, and was there any rationale given as to why such a short amount of time for the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, given their importance and given the explicit wish of the committee?
Thank you, Mr. Genis. Well, of course, I'm not sure it's a point of order. It's more of a matter of discussion and negotiations that should be taking place with the committee. Having said that, as you're aware, I am the vice chair and I'm subbed in at the last minute, and I'm not. I was not privy to discussions that went on with respect to the timing of the visit by the UCC. I do share some concerns, however, that the time is simply not enough, and it would have been nice if the committee could just simply agree before the end of this meeting. It was clear to me by the motion that we were supposed to have more than one meeting. I think it's right in the motion to hear from witnesses. I think we should all just be able to agree on that so that we can move forward. So I'd leave that for a discussion of committee members. That would be my recommendation.
Mr. Chair, just to clarify, you as vice chair were not consulted by the
Point
chair.
of order, Mr. Chair, that you have clearly stated that what Mr. Genuis is doing right now does not fall into the point of order category. I would invite you as chair to please continue on with the meeting.
The meeting, I don't think it's a point of order. although I think it would be reasonable to have more meetings, and that was what was discussed in the motion. So we are at the end of our meeting, the first meeting. We're going to adjourn. I understand new login details will be issued by the clerk, and we will reconvene at 3:30 Central Eastern Time.
They were
Thank
sent
you.
at 1:18 to all members.
Thank you very much, Mr. Clerk.